this up here again. The link to this, the entire series, actually this lecture, and then really it's like a whole series that you can get, is all in the show description. In this component of the lecture, he's talking about criticisms of advertising. And then he has another lecture where he's talking about the history of the defense of advertising, which doesn't really hold water, as he points out, and needs to be updated given social media. And it's a good way for him to offer a balance to his bias, because as he acknowledges, and his work has always been about, he's looking almost very critically at the impact and history of advertising on media. And as I've pointed out, in many ways, learning much from him over the years, it's advertising that determines the content of commercial mainstream media, not the interests of the artists or the consumers, but he here Jhally starts talking about the work of the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, and raises the point that for too long the study of advertising has been conducted in the context of business and marketing and economics, but not considered enough socially and for its social impact. And again, as we talk about all the time, and as he talks about in one of the other lectures, slightly differently, but making the same point. But whenever people are talking about Marx and Engels, it's not simply an economic issue, as they pointed out. This is about how the social relationships in society are arranged. So he that is, Jhally starts bringing these questions in that he got from Galbraith, and in trying to assess. And we're answering these questions here. Why does advertising exist? How does advertising work? And then what effects does advertising have? And raising the question, in sort of in the context of Galbraith's economics question, which was at the time, and I think is relevant still, why, as capitalists are always arguing, does an economy have to forever expand or grow? Why does there always need to be growth? Now, we know that Marx, in his work on capital and others elsewhere, have talked about the need for money to be moving. It needs to circulate. That's why savings and circulating dollars in a segregated economy don't generate wealth, because wealth it only works if it's moving. But that's only necessary if you're constantly needing an economy to expand. What if an economy doesn't expand and is just satisfying the needs of society and the environment? You take away anyway. So that's sort of the where Jhally is building this. But as again, the point in terms of media, I think is important, because it's this ever need to expand is connected to the development and the military aspect of the development of communication and communications technology, satellites, going back from the work of Herbert Schiller and the expansion of the telegraph being and the post office being about expanding the military reach of the United States across the so-called the Western expanse. Now we're into cyberspace, outer space, full spectrum dominance, ever expanding, looking for new territories to conquer, resources and markets, et cetera, and so forth. So but it's always interesting to sort of stop for a second and ask, well, why is that necessary? What if we don't do that? What if we stop doing that? Can't we just? So then Jhally starts talking about again trying to evolve to this discussion of the role of advertising and the purpose of advertising. That the purpose of advertising ultimately, as he points out, is to create consumers for the products that society is producing in order to drive the GDP. Again, the GDP as a measurement of the wealth created for those who own society, that wealth is created through the production, the sale, and the exploitation of the labor that is involved in the production that precedes the sale. And then, of course, to make all of that work and to not stagnate and fall apart, as we saw happening during the pandemic, you need consumers. So to produce consumption, and one of the ways that these Jhally is talking about the ways that this process is justified. The defense includes that that production is necessary because it creates jobs, and then production is also necessary because it satisfies the consumer needs. That's always the initial defense, as Jhally points out, as I think Galbraith was pointing out, of why we need to produce instead of the other thing. Why do we need to keep producing all this if we already, and as he points out, Marx has already said that capitalism has solved the problem of production. We can produce everything that we need. We can also manage that production, slow it down, redistribute the wealth, and that's the advance of socialism and so forth. But if there's no need to generate all that wealth, we don't need to in this way, we don't need to produce, and then we don't need to create consumers. So he's pointing out that this is part of the initial defense, that it creates jobs, that is production, and then it satisfies the needs of consumers. So then Jhally starts to ask the question, as did Galbraith, well, what produces that demand? And this is where in my class, this always becomes an issue. And obviously I'm not alone. That's why Jhally is doing these lectures, because this happens for all of us who raise these issues in all of our classes. Somebody, if not many people, invariably say, well, they're producing because they're giving us what we want. They're referring to point number 2. And even when you raise questions, inviting them to consider, well, how did you reach this number 2 conclusion? Where do you get that from? And even when there's an acknowledgement that there is no real clear answer for that, this is where they get stuck, because of course part of it is, again, the unconscious or subconscious defensiveness around, I'm not being manipulated. I am my own person. So this is where Jhally brings up what Galbraith offers as part of the solution. And that is what they call the accepted sequence. Okay, there's an accepted sequence that is offered in most, at least for most of my career, and as Jhally points out, most of his, in most media and communication studies textbooks, to the extent that I've seen them in most basic economic textbooks. Certainly the popular discussion all revolves around this accepted sequence. And the accepted sequence, as he's going to show here, is again that consumers create the demand and then producers produce to satisfy that demand. And that things are only happening because consumers are saying, hey, we want X, Y, and Z, and producers are saying, hey, you know what? We're only here to do what you want. So we're going to produce what you need. And in the context that I'm building towards for my hip hop class, it speaks to, why do we get the kinds of music that we get, or the kinds of films that we get, or the popular podcasts that we get? Well, this is what the people want. So that's the accepted sequence. We get what we ask for. We get what we want. We get what we deserve. So as he shows here, this is the accepted sequence. There's a consumer on one end, there's the market in the middle, and there's the producer. And the accepted sequence says the consumer basically creates themselves as the market, and then the producer steps in to produce that which is being asked for. And in the accepted sequence component, the consumer is first or primary. They generate and become the market, and they tell the producer what they want. And as Jhally raises very interestingly, and this is what I'm saying about what comes up in my classes all the time, how do both, two things. How do consumers both determine what they want and then somehow organize that? Like, where are these organizational meetings and conferences happening where we all are gathered to not only determine what we want, but then somehow make that known to the producing world? Because as Jhally is pointing out, we don't have an advertising mechanism. Consumers don't have an advertising industry that exists specifically and only to promote our interests to the producing world. It's the exact opposite. It's anyway, and yet it even to raise the question, because of the beauty and the sophisticated delivery of all of this, and the time and the billions of dollars. Remember, Chris Simpson said back in the 1950s they were already investing $1 billion annually into the study and research, into the research and study of the development of the consumer, of the development of public opinion and mass consciousness. So so by today, even to raise this as a question generates a defensiveness. For Galbraith, the accepted sequence cannot be reconciled with the existence of a massive advertising industry, the function of which is to create demand. But this is the question. He's saying, look, if we stop looking at this strictly as a business issue and something socially, it doesn't work. It stops making sense. Because how can you argue, just as I was saying, that I was just paraphrasing this. How can you argue that consumers are organizing their desires and then delivering those desires in a way that impacts producers to create that? How can you argue that is the case when there exists an advertising industry whose function is to create the demand for the producers? And again, Jhally's doing it, and I'm definitely doing it as I'm summarizing his work. But this issue of the creation of demand. He goes into more in the video, but it is itself a summary of this massive amounts of research and resources that have been put into that research that I was just talking about. They earned their ability through exploitation and violence and enslavement and colonization and research and imperialism. They've earned the ability to know us better than we know ourselves, which is what many advertisers, and Jhally goes into this more in these series of lectures. But through all of the data they collect on us, particularly by this point, and they had already begun to figure this out more clearly by the 1970s. But by today, with all of the data they collect on us, they in many ways do know us better than we know ourselves. And they can predict attitudes and interests and trends. They can encourage attitudes, interests, and trends with all of this data that we willfully give over of ourselves by doing what I'm doing here, by what we do just about every day when we shop, when our thoughts leave our minds, and even probably before then, they have already begun collecting and mining that data. And with it, they can do all types of things, including which is learning how to manipulate us, to create us as consumers, and worse. So then Galbraith and Jhally, talking about it, develop what they call the revised sequence. Atop here is the accepted sequence we've just been talking about. But the revised sequence, which is the opposite, in other words, it's the opposite of the accepted sequence. Here, the producer, through advertising, generates and creates the consumer and the market into which the consumer consumes. So a little bit I talk about this in the second edition of the buying power, my buying power argument and work, which is that piece that we covered in chapter 3 about after the Second World War, the ruling elite realizing that they had still all of this productive capacity that they were using to make military and technology and weaponry, et cetera. They said, we have all of these machines, like we have all this ability to produce, why waste it? So we'll just stop making weapons and start making other products. And then again, we need to be able to sell those products. We have to be able to create consumers. We have to be able to create demand for what we have the ability to mass produce. I was talking about it more in terms of the ideological and the immaterial impact in terms of developing national identities and racial constructs and concepts of wedding democracy to freedom and capitalism to democracy and so on and so forth. But here the focus is more on how are we going to make sure that, look, we're not turning the machines off. They're just going to start producing, clothes instead of guns, or computers for the home instead of computers for warfare or whatever. I don't know. But we need people to buy it. So we need to make sure that they know that they want this. We have to create their desires. So this is where as Jhally points out, this reverses the model where producers create the market and then the consumers who will purchase those goods. The role of advertising is to create demand. And as Stuart Ewan pointed out, one of the early scholars to study advertising in this sort of critical social way back, I believe, in the 70s, Ewan says, such social production of consumers represented a shift in social and political priorities, which has since characterized much of the life of American industrial capitalism. The functional goal of national advertising was the creation of desires and habits. The functional goal of national advertising was the creation of desires and habits. In tune with the need for mass distribution that accompanied the development of mass production capabilities, advertising was trying to produce in readers' needs which would dependently fluctuate with the expanding marketplace. Advertising was trying to produce in readers' needs which would dependently fluctuate with the expanding marketplace. So as I understand that, and I believe as Jhally was pointing out, what Ewan is saying, if we can create broad desires and habits, we can manipulate and tweak them as production and business needs and the marketplace fluctuate. I would argue and just add that if there becomes something, if something does emerge from communities that are clamoring for something, whether it is a particular product or, again, to the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance, to self-representation in popular media, then this apparatus can adjust itself and produce that in the context of the habits and desires they've already created as a baseline. So that's why if they're paying attention and there's, oh, you want more Black people in movies? Fine. But we're going to give it to you based on the habits and desires we've already generated. So we'll give it to you in terms of Black excellence, or we'll put Black characters in roles that are traditionally occupied by whites, with there being no difference other than the complexion of the actor. Oh, queer folks want to be seen? Cool. We'll throw you in here and there, and we'll put that in the same context we've already established. So these aren't queer revolutionaries you're going to see, something else. And on it goes, and on it goes. And same thing with hip hop. Oh, you've created this new art form, this new form of expression. It's not going away. Okay, cool. Start advertising sodas and cars. We'll start managing, as I'm going to show you in a few minutes, playlists, and we'll just kick in the payola, and then advertising will manage popular culture in the exact same way it managed traditional advertising. And then as Jhally points out, and again, we saw in the pandemic, without ads, the system collapses because the circular process of capital that must continue with the ad industry creating the wants to serve the needs of that social and economic model. Without that happening, consumption stops, and then the economy collapses. And that's why, as I've been pointing out, whether in the buying power work, the top 200 ad buyers put out almost $200 billion annually. And overall, it's projected to be $500-600 billion in annual ad buying. That's a lot of money to get after. And what that does is it assures, and I think with what I'm going to show here in terms, it assures complete control over the end product, what becomes popular, what disappears. And that works for academic work, political ideas, ideas around identity, gender, sexuality, and certainly pop culture and entertainment, so-called entertainment. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.